Okay, Roman, thank you for joining me again.
Great to be here.
So let me just take a couple of minutes to summarize what we talked about last time. I think last time um, uh, I said that diagnosis and the way we do it is perplexing and seems to be confusing. And I think, at least that's my thesis, is that right now in modern practice, we blend in two different intellectual traditions in medicine. And those traditions are quite distinct and, in fact, are incompatible in many ways. But yet we've blended them because historically that's how it's happened. And those two traditions are, one would be the Hippocratic tradition, and two would be the scientific tradition. Um, and and then we spent most of the time talking about the scientific view of diagnosis, and I started not in the 19th century. That's where we typically think about the origin of modern medicine or scientific medicine. But I traced it back to Descartes as the sort of the prototypical philosopher of the modern scientific revolution. Um, and my point was that Descartes very clearly and philosophically and most articulately decided that the world, the entire cosmos, should be viewed in mechanical terms, and not just the cosmos in terms of the planets and whatnot, but even living things, right? So he viewed all living organisms in mechanical terms. The reason there was an appeal to those ideas in his days, at the time of Descartes, was because, first of all, there were some difficulties in the way of conceiving of the physical world at the time. They were about the Aristotelian worldview was being challenged and was meeting certain challenges it had difficulty overcoming. And then ancient texts were rediscovered about ancient Greek philosophies, the Epicureans and the Stoics. And the Epicurean and Stoics were adepts of ancient atomism. They were followers of, at least in terms of natural philosophy, they were followers of Democritus. And so they viewed the world in atomistic terms. They thought that the world, the material world, they had a theory of matter that was that matter is composed of tiny little parts that are set in motion by, whatever forces, or they were not that explicit. But that gave the modern philosophers of the 17th, late Renaissance, 17th century, sort of something to work with. And so Descartes worked with it and ran away with it, especially since he was a mathematician and could marry modern mathematics to atomism and come up with ideas about physics. So that was the impetus for the scientific revolution. And then in the 19th century, that began to bear fruit in medicine, and then that started to infiltrate medical education. So medical education was reformed in Germany and then in the US to sort of align itself with this mechanistic view of the world. And from that mechanistic view of the world and of organisms and of essentially human bodies as well, emerges an idea about what health is and what disease is. In such a way that bodies are viewed as mechanics, right? The phrase from Descartes is that a healthy body is a well-made clock, and therefore diseases are seen as defect in the mechanism, right? As a defect, and so the disease becomes the focus of attention. The defect becomes the focus of attention. The part that is defective, or the relationship between parts that is defective, becomes the focus of attention in modern medical diagnosis. And health becomes a little bit secondary, right? Health is then viewed as the absence of a defect, the absence of disease. So that becomes sort of the medical paradigm, the modern medical scientific paradigm for health and disease. But the problem is that it assumes that we know what the well-made clock is. It assumes that there's kind of a paradigm of machinery that human beings are supposed to follow, but there's none. And so when we think about disease or diagnosis, at least as a defect, it really doesn't work that way. even though we've imported from mechanical sciences this diagnostic reasoning process of detection. So this our diagnostic reasoning with the judging a test according to its false positive and false negative rate and so forth. All of this assumes that there's a gold standard, but there's no gold standard of a human being, and there's no gold standard of a person with a disease. We used COVID last time as the paradigm disease. We can't see a prototype of what COVID diagnosis is and then compare your patient to that prototype to make a diagnosis. And the reason we can't is because organisms are not machines. And then we talked a little bit about the ways in which living organisms, are radically distinct from machines. Because organisms are not assemblies of parts. We're not made up. We always start from a previously existing organism, and it's a process of development. So even a sperm and an egg, I mean, those are previously existing organisms, and there's a transformation and a development into a new organism. And so it's not a process of assembly. And there's I don't know if I mentioned that, but there's a substantial or an essential unity to an organism, which it doesn't exist in machines, which are by definition made of parts, right? Where in the machine, the mechanical view, the part is really fundamental and essential, and the machine emerges from the assembly of the parts. In an organism, it's not the case. And organisms are there's a self to an organism, and they're self-directing, self-healing, self, flourishing, or however you want to put it. And I think that's where we left it. And so here, I'm going to let you maybe share your reflections or your thoughts on what we talked about last time before we move on to the alternative view of the Hippocratic view.
Thanks. Just had a quick comment about what we discussed last time, and specifically about Descartes. And when we see this reatomization of philosophy with the sciences under Descartes, what's interesting is that he still had to, at that time, find a place for the soul to be somehow different from this material atomization that he subjected the rest of reality to. Mm-hmm. So we live in a materialistic world. Everything is atoms. It moves mechanically, but the soul is somehow different. It doesn't. He leaves this coda, a remainder that puts the whole project into question, I think, because it defies that unity that he's trying to achieve, but ultimately is not able to fully commit to. I mean, you can be cynical about it and say that's because of the influence of the church in the 1600s, but I think there's still a part to it, because if you consider the philosophy of one of his contemporaries, another great mathematician, Pascal, he definitely, I think, would have had great difficulty subjecting to this idea that everything is mechanics. Mm-hmm. Pascal was a sickly individual, but he also had a lot of faith, and his philosophy is existential to the sense that he tried to bridge that gap, and he ended up resigning on the side of the spirit rather than the mechanics, at least pure mechanics.
Right. Yeah. You're absolutely right. So, I mean, there's a fundamental difficulty for mechanicism, for strict mechanicism, to account for what seems to be, such a fundamental experiential reality that we all share, which is that we have an individual will, right? We seem to be free. We seem to make decisions on our own. So Descartes thought that he couldn't. I mean, perhaps he didn't. I mean, was he a closeted atheist and he didn't want to upset? I mean, that's possible. He didn't want. He saw what had happened to Galileo and he was afraid to speak his mind. Who knows? We don't know that. But even if he wasn't, I mean, he needed to give account to the fact that human beings have free will, and therefore he had to still invoke the existence of the soul, right? Whereas for animals, he could plausibly, I mean, I think it's kind of, even there, it's, to me, it's kind of implausible, but he could plausibly say that animals are completely mechanical and have no will at all and no decision-making capacity, which goes contrary to our perception of how animals, dogs behave and so forth. They seem to make decisions, at least, not necessarily in what they do, but in how they do things, right? Um, so Descartes, had introduced this dualism between the mechanics and the soul, but he had no way of explaining how the two would interact. But nevertheless, his worldview was influential, even though essentially all modern philosophers since then, for the most part, have rejected his dualism and have tried to find other ways to preserve mechanicism on the one hand, and on the other hand, give an account to how spiritual beings or beings with will, could exist. And for the most part, they have not been successful. And so you get, or, you could have the strict materialists that will deny, that will say that the free will is an illusion. And you have those nowadays, you have people like Daniel Dennett and people like that who just say that, we have the illusion of free will. So, I mean, that's one solution, is to just completely give in to mechanicism and think that everything else is an illusion. But what you end up having essentially is that philosophers start to compartmentalize, and they will say, well, we leave the mechanics of the material world, of the physical world, to the scientists, right? So you have the separation between science and philosophy, and then everything that has to do with what we think is a human sort of will and whatnot, that becomes, people start to have philosophies about that, whether it's ethical philosophies or even cognitive philosophies on its own terms, kind of divorced a little bit from the body. So the dualism of Descartes remains, even though people, don't find any kind of satisfactory explanation for it. It kind of remains. And then nowadays there's a kind of a popular idea of, mental phenomena kind of emerging out of the complexity of the body. I think that's not, it doesn't hold up very well as far as I'm concerned, but it certainly is a popular idea. There's sort of this emergence, right? Emergence phenomena. But yeah, so you're right. But at the same time, since the mechanical worldview that Descartes introduced became so successful technologically speaking, and with the science, right, the development of the sciences, which then start to focus their attention not so much on explaining the world, but on transforming the world or predicting, right? So the focus becomes on prediction and transformation, and using mathematics to both predict and to transform. That nobody is willing to give that up, that mechanic, and clearly there's some good to it. So we need to figure out a way that it all could fit together. But yeah, so the mechanicism of Descartes is still around, and also his skepticism, because it's he came to it, or he brought with it. He also, his other main contribution, which is linked to mechanicism, is a contribution of total skepticism, a very radical skepticism, precisely a skepticism about how we interpret what dogs are and what animals are, because we seem to think that they have some kind of nature, and he thinks no, they have no nature. They're completely mechanical beings, so they're made of parts. So each time you're an atomist, right? I mean, all atomists fundamentally are skeptics, because atomism implies that the fundamental reality is at the level of the part, at the level of the atom, and that what we perceive with our senses is an illusion. Democritus himself, the ancient, the father of atomism, there's a saying from Democritus I don't have it. I mean, it was something like this. It was something like, by convention, color, by convention, um, smells. I can't remember. It was by convention, this. In reality, atoms and the void, right? So the fundamental reality was the atoms and the void, and everything else is sort of conventional. The dogs and cats and what we are, and these natures or whatnot are so it's mechanicism invites skepticism, because what we perceive with our own senses as human beings, it cannot be trusted, because fundamentally what is real is the parts. I think that's all I have to say about about this.
Marcus Aurelius has a similar quote. There's one passage where he's criticizing pleasure seeking, which is a lot of Marcus Aurelius, but he's talking about how, like, basically wine is, it's basically wine is just grapes. It's just grapes that have been crushed.
Right.
It's trying to separate what is actually versus what is our perception of it. And arguing that in a way our perception of and what we see, even if it's an illusion, isn't even the illusion itself may not perhaps be real.
Yeah, that's right. So Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic, and so the Stoics, just like the Epicurean, were fundamentally believers in atomisms. And even though for some reason, I mean, I'm not sure, perhaps you have better insights, because I haven't read the Stoics that much at all, but they're mainly known for their ethical worldview, right? So their ethical principles, and likewise for the Epicureans. But I'm not sure how they go from atomism to Stoicism, or from atomism to Epicureanism.
The way Stoics saw things was that everything was placed, like, by intelligent design, effectively.
Okay, right.
So you're a physician because it's almost like predestination or predeterminism, where it's everything that happened for a reason. Right. And they mixed it with like Platonic idealism, in the sense that they believed that everything was ordered, but there was a highest order. So the ethics came from matching our like daily situations and the disorder in which things may be found towards their understanding of that highest order. And so the ethics flows from that. But the idea was that the way we act is entirely it's driven by this great machine, effectively.
Right. Okay. Anything else, or should I move on? Or
I think we can go ahead and get to the next part.
Okay. So the next thread was the So I'm going to talk about the Hippocratic line, and again, so it's not a parallel, because Hippocrates was not a philosopher, right? As Descartes was. He was a physician, and in fact, in some way, the Hippocratic school physicians, they were self-consciously anti-philosophical. Hippocrates lived before Aristotle, a century before, about 100 years before, maybe more, 100 to 150 years. I don't have the dates exactly. And already the philosophical, so before Aristotle came up with what I think is a very good solution to the problem of, the mind and the body and the world, and I mean how to square all that and not fall into all the various traps of idealism or mechanicism, or denying that there's any change, or thinking that there's constant change and there's no identity. Those all these philosophical problems that were prevalent at the time of Hippocrates. The Hippocratic schools sort of said, we're not going to bother with these philosophical things. We are doctors, and we want to do thinks we're going to develop medicine, and we want to be, we're not going to be too bothered with philosophical questions. That was at least um, um, uh, uh, with the original Hippocratic school. That was the case. You will see then that later on, when there's in late antiquity, there's not late antiquity. I mean, shortly actually, in middle antiquity, um, there's a waning of the influence of the Hippocratic school, and then there is a renaissance of it with Galen in the 2nd century AD. Okay, so about 400 years later, 400 or 500 years later, there's a renaissance, and Galen, on the other hand, is much more philosophical and views takes philosophy much more seriously. But by then, Aristotle had been around, so I think he had a philosophical, he had philosophical tools to work with, which Hippocrates did not. But anyway, so let me, with all this philosophical digression, let me go back down to earth with Hippocrates here as an alternative to the scientific view about health and disease. And I'm going to start with a quote from the Oath. It's a very important document, the Hippocratic Oath, in many, many different ways. But, after the first paragraph, the Oath is really 4 paragraphs. I mean, it's not very long. But the first one is an invocation to the gods and so forth. The second one says, I will use treatment to help the sick according to my ability and judgment, but never with a view to injury and wrongdoing. So the point that I want to emphasize here is the term the sick, and helping the sick as being the primary mission of the Hippocratic physician. And that phrase, help the sick, comes back in the second, in later on in the Oath, in the paragraph that begins where, into whatsoever houses I enter, I will enter to help the sick. And I will abstain from intentional wrongdoing and harm, especially from abusing the bodies of men and women, bond or free. So here, helping the sick is very important because, number one, the sick is a whole, right? The sick is not a part, even though we have parts, but it means that the focus of the Hippocratic physician is on the whole. I mean, if this is his mission, he says the sentence twice in his oath, I'm going to help the sick. That means his focus is going to be on the whole, primarily, right? The sick is not a part. Interestingly, there's a linguistic quirk. Health in English, the word health in English, comes from the Old English hale. I think it's pronounced hale, H-A-L-E, with hale, which means whole. So the medieval English, when they used, or used the term for health, they used the term that came from whole. In Greek, in ancient Greek, it's hygeia, and hygeia had to do with hygiene. So it's a bit of a different source or origin or etymology. But health, the word health pertains to whole. And in the Hippocratic tradition, clearly the focus is on the whole. And so that's important because Hippocratic medicine is about helping the sick, which I think is distinct from curing diseases, right? I mean, you could say, what is a doctor? A doctor is somebody who cures diseases. I think that would be it would be more in line with what how the modern physician views himself, perhaps, right? As opposed to helping the sick. And these are distinct because, as we will see, I hope, they're not mirror images of one another, right? Helping the sick and curing diseases are not necessarily the same thing. So I think medicine, or Hippocratic medicine, was about helping the sick primarily. Now, it's helping the sick insofar as they are sick, right? So therefore, they must be unhealthy, they must have some disease. Before we get into this, I want to draw attention to another. So when people think about Hippocratic medicine, they think about the oath, of course, but we also think about the Hippocratic, the humoral theory of disease, right? The 4 humors: yellow bile, green bile, or black bile, yellow bile, blood, and I forgot what the phlegm, right? So the Hippocratic physicians, in their treatises and in the Hippocratic texts, they invoke this this idea about disease and the humoral theory of health and disease, which I think we need to pay attention to. So we tend to, us moderns, we tend to dismiss it completely as being a completely sort of backward, unscientific idea, you know. But I think it's actually not only is it has merit, but we continue to use it, and I think I'm going to try to show you why. The most important point is that the humoral theory of disease viewed health as a state of balance, right? So, and the idea was that the four humors, black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, were, if you were healthy, it was a state of balance. So the view of health was a state of balance, and disease was a state of imbalance. Oops, sorry, let me back up on my slides here. And disease was a state of imbalance. And I think that's a very interesting and pertinent remark or attitude towards health and disease. Because on my next slide here, I'm going to show you the picture of someone who, if you look at him, it's a picture of Ray Charles, the pianist, the blues and rhythm and blues pianist Ray Charles, who's looks extremely very, very handsome. He has a dashing smile. He's there by his piano. He looks great, and he wears his his famous Ray-Ban black shades, his dark glasses, because he was blind. Okay, so Ray Charles was blind. But if you look at this picture of Ray Charles, you don't think of somebody being unhealthy here. I mean, he looks like the perfect idea of health in some ways. And perhaps if you ask him, I don't know, if you had asked him, Ray, how do you feel? Are you healthy? He might say, I'm perfectly healthy, despite the fact that he had a defect. He had a very pronounced defect. He couldn't see, right? So there was a huge defect in the machine, right? But I think I would venture to guess that if you had asked him, he would say, no, I'm healthy. And I think it's our experience as well. Many times, you haven't practiced medicine. You will one day, Roman. But for us, we see tons of people who are very maimed. They're amputees, or they have, some, and you see them in the clinic, and then you ask them, how are you doing? Well, I'm doing perfectly well, right? So they will tell you that despite many very, very challenging physical problems that they have that indicate, there's a large parts of their body that are not functioning well at all. Nevertheless, they're able to maintain a certain state of being that is sufficient for them to, whatever it might be, to achieve whatever goals they are, and they feel that they're in a state of, at that particular time, they're in a state of balance, right? So I think health as a state of balance is a very important idea. And I don't think you cannot have that from mechanicism, because mechanicism doesn't really have, doesn't have a good idea about the whole thing, right? It can only judge the part and the function of the part and the relationship between parts. So health is a state of balance. That would be the Hippocratic view, and I think it's very important. And so conversely, disease, being unhealthy, is primarily a state of imbalance. Okay. So that's where being unhealthy is, or comes out. Being sick, you're sick when there's something wrong, that there's something sort of out of balance. On this picture here, in contrast, to the picture of Ray Charles, I have a picture of Winston Churchill, and I want to talk about Winston Churchill a little bit here, because number one, you can look at his picture, and I think he's obese. Okay, so I think he's obese, and I can tell that not from weighing him or getting his BMI. I can tell because I can see that there's kind of a disproportion between his height and his girth, and I can sense that immediately, right? So I can immediately sense the obesity. I don't have to measure it. I don't have to sort of, mechanically put a number to it and say, oh, I'm outside the specifications that human beings should be. I can see that he's obese, okay? And that's important. Now, does it mean that Churchill was sick? That's an important question that requires yet another level of distinction, if you will, because it's quite possible that despite being obese, he was perfectly well. He felt perfectly well and never sought the attention of the doctor. Okay, and he would not consider himself sick, and I think we should respect that as well. Um, we have a tendency, it's very pronounced in modern medicine, to go out and tell people whether they are sick or not, whether they feel it or not, whether they believe it or not, that we can tell that they are sick or not sick. I think that's very tricky. We're not going to get into this in detail here. It's very tricky because at the same time, the subjectivity of how a person feels is not necessarily also the end all be all of whether somebody is healthy or not. But there is a subjective dimension. I mean, a human being has to be able to judge for himself or herself, whether they feel sick or healthy. I mean, that has to count for something. So we have to be mindful of that. But the main point here that I want to say is that this question about the state of balance that Hippocrates or the Hippocratic physicians talked about or referred to when they talked about health, I think is quite important. And I think we continue to do, we naturally, intuitively apply that even today, even when we think we practice modern medicine, we continue to intuitively, at least we try to accept that the system tries to counter us, because the system, if we look at Winston Churchill, the system will force us to view things in mechanical terms, which would be, if we're talking about weight and obesity and whatnot, which would be according to a bell-shaped curve, and then with arbitrarily defined borderlines, right? So you have a bell-shaped curve of weight, right? And then you will have arbitrarily defined cutoff points, like for a BMI, for example, you will have a cutoff point that will be imposed. It will say, okay, above the BMI of X, then you are overweight or you are obese or whatnot, or so, which is really contrary to what obesity really is. I mean, intuitively, you would say, no, it has to be in proportion to everything else. I mean, you have to judge the whole thing, and you can't really measure, even though the BMI attempts to take the height of the person and the girth and whatnot, but it's still very mechanical. It's mechanical, and there are many people whose BMI falls on one side or the other, right? And according to the cutoffs, the mechanical cutoffs should be deemed either obese or lean or whatnot, when in fact they're not. And it's because their body composition is in such and such way, or because whatever, maybe they're missing a limb or whatever it is. The numbers come out wrong, and we know that they're wrong, and hopefully we can override what the mechanical approach will have us do. The only problem is that if all we learn now and more we have these guidelines with these mechanical cutoffs, telling us how to think and how to evaluate patients, that can be very damaging. So I use weight here with the example of Churchill, but it's true for many different things. It's true with when we measure blood pressure. We have these arbitrary cutoffs that tell us, well, blood pressure, I'm going to use a blood pressure of 140/90 differently if I'm dealing with an 80-year-old or if I'm dealing with a 30-year-old, right? Because I'm going to put that number in context of the whole person, right? And if I do that in context, then it may be that in a 30-year-old or an 18-year-old's blood pressure is 140/90. That's, to me, is a sense of something being imbalanced, and I can sort of intuitively, not completely, not without experience. I mean, you need some sort of experience. You need to know. You need to have measured the blood pressure to know the blood pressure. You need to have a sense, but nevertheless, you're still going to put it in context. Or even if you have a 30-year-old man or woman whose blood pressure is 140/90, well, is it because it's really very cold in the room and they're shivering and whatnot, or they're nervous, or right? So I need to put that into context as well. So I need to contextualize my finding of 140/90, and you cannot really mechanically contextualize it, because there's no, as we talked about last time, there's no Vitruvian man that will give you all the references and all the, that doesn't exist, right? You have to, with experience, be able to contextualize your numbers, whether it's your blood pressure, your weight, your your glucose, right? Your glucose value, your blood test that you get, you have to put it in context. Always refer back to the whole, and see, is it out of balance to what you perceive to be the whole, based on how the patient looks, what they're complaining about. I mean, the whole thing. You just put the whole thing together, and we do this intuitively. We do this all the time, and good doctors continue to do it, despite the fact that we aim to practice scientific medicine, but luckily, for the most part, although I think it's in danger, but for the most part, we still invoke very good Hippocratic principles of viewing health as a state of balance. And I have one more example here that I want to show you, because I'm a cardiologist and I look at echocardiograms all the time. And this is a picture of an echocardiogram. And the echocardiogram, you will have reference tables for the sizes of the different chambers. The left atrium is supposed to be less than so many millimeters, and the left ventricle and the dimensions and whatnot. But 9 times out of 10, when I look at a measurement that the sonographer has made, or that sometimes I make myself, the measurement doesn't jive with what I see, because I look at the heart, I look at the 4 chambers in this ultrasound picture. So I have an ultrasound picture that has all 4 chambers, and I look at the left atrium in proportion to the other, right? So I immediately make an evaluation of proportion between the different chambers before I decide if the left atrium is too large or not large, or normal or not, right? And frequently I don't care. I discount what the actual measurement is. Okay, so I think these are things that we do, and when we do them, we import them from the Hippocratic tradition. So a Hippocratic diagnosis, it's not a specific defect to be discovered, right? Which is the mechanical view, but I think it's a categorization of a pattern of being sick, and being sick being out of balance. So it's a disproportion, or some way of being out of balance, whose recognition helps physicians help the sick, because ultimately the goal of the doctor is to help the sick, to help the whole person, to help the individual. Okay, so that's the view of the Hippocratic diagnosis, that we continue to use. It continues to inform our diagnostic reasoning. We're not at all explicit about it, because if you look at textbooks or articles about diagnostic reasoning, all you will have nowadays, you will have these 2 by 2 tables of detection, signal detection algorithms that we mentioned last time, right? This false positive, false negatives, and whatnot. And you will have no reference whatsoever to the Hippocratic diagnosis. But I think it's a very important mode of thinking, and we should be aware of it, and we should cultivate it, and it should, if I had my ways, it would become part of the curriculum. It would be reinstated in the curriculum. It would be, we'd give it its due worth, right? I mean, its due respect. It would have the respect that it is due. And I want to stop here, because there's more to be said about what a diagnosis is. But I think I'll leave that for perhaps next time, where we'll marry a little bit these 2 approaches when we talk about the parts and we talk about the whole, because it's important to get it right, and it's complicated. But I wanted to at least introduce these few ideas from Hippocratism, and try to hopefully, in the mind of the audience, maybe sensitize them to the value. And we're so conditioned to dismissing completely the old Hippocratic ways, the thing of this humoral theory. But really, we practice this humoral theory all the time, right? When we look at cholesterol levels and whatnot, we really look at them we should be at least looking at them in context, and not according to strict bell-shaped criteria with arbitrary cutoff, as if those were the tolerance limits of the parts. Above that, the part is no good. It needs to be discarded or fixed, and otherwise the part needs to be kept between very tight tolerance limits within a bell-shaped curve. So that's what I have to say here. Any thoughts about that, Roman?
I think your point about, how would you say, the subjectivity of the patient is especially key, because you're right. In industrial engineering and engineering in general, when dealing with machines, we do this idea of homeostasis still exists. It's there.
Yep.
Machines are designed to have some inputs, some outputs, and you want to control deviation within those systems.
Mm-hmm.
But the key difference between biological autopoietic um, beings and machines is that the mechanical nature of machines tends towards a dissatisfaction with its own efficiency, let's call it. So even when homeostasis is maintained in the mechanical worldview, there's always a way to maintain the homeostasis more efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
Use less resources, you invest less time managing it, etc. So in fact, the key difference, I think, is not this maintenance of homeostasis, but this aspect of satiation, and that the machine itself can never be satisfied with what it is. It has to constantly be improved.
Right.
Actually,
Or the engineer cannot be
or,
satisfied with the machine sufficiently.
exactly.
Right. The engineer
It
cannot be
has to
satisfied.
keep working on it. Whereas
Correct.
with patients, you can be blind, you can be maimed, and you can adjust to your condition and be able to live a completely normal, in your perspective, life. I think
Right.
Herbert Marcuse he has many critiques of modernity, but in one of his critiques, he's sort of criticizing democracy and how it developed to the point where we're constantly being measured for our political views. We're constantly being polled. We're constantly being assessed. And so it creates this condition where we are living in a sort of what he calls, quote, democratic unfreedom, where we are free, but because of the constant supervision
Mm-hmm.
that is applied on us, we end up being, in fact, unfree. And I think
Yeah.
the mechanical view of health, it creates this exact parallel scenario where we exist in a constant state of medical unhealth.
Right. I mean, ask any doctor now whose paycheck depends on meeting metrics, right,
Right.
in their panels that all their patients should have a hemoglobin A1C of less than X and all that stuff. I mean, it's absolutely it's horrendous.
Exactly. Churchill might have been very satisfied with his
Yeah. In
with
fact, I think he
his
was, and in fact, he lived a very long. Right. He was a smoker, an alcoholic, and whatnot, and
exactly.
he defied all expectations and lived into his
He
90s.
lived a very satisfied life, but his
Right.
healthcare, the NHS would have begged to defer.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So I'm gonna. I moved the slides back to the oath, to the quote that I shown, because here the quote from Hippocrates in the oath. I'm going to read it again. It says, "Into whatsoever houses I enter, I will enter to help the sick, and I will abstain from all intentional wrongdoing and harm, especially from abusing the bodies of man and woman, bond or free," meaning slave or free. That is such a revolutionary statement. It's really, I don't know to what extent people realize it, how, I mean, revolutionary in a good, enlightened way, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, we're talking here about um, uh, uh, people in Greece in the 400s BC, right, where slavery was rampant. I mean, why in the world would a doctor treat a patient similarly if they're free? I mean, right? I mean, the default, I mean, the expectation would be you treat a slave like cattle. I mean, it's the property of it should be the property of somebody. But the point here is the recognition that all human beings, the recognition by Hippocrates, or whoever wrote the oath, that all human beings are free beings, right? Even if you're a slave, you're still free. And that's in your nature. It's in the nature of a human being to be free. And so as a physician, you have to respect. I mean, that's your, if you're a veterinary, if you're a vet, right? If you're a vet and you're dealing with cattle, the subjectivity of the cow doesn't really come into it shouldn't, right? You're going to treat the cow and you're going to treat the diseases of the cow whether the cow likes it or not, right? And the cow may not like it if the treatment is can hurt or whatnot. But you're going to treat the right. So the beast is not free. Same thing with the plant. You're going to treat the plant whether the plant likes it or not. But a human being is a free being. We mentioned that when we talk about Descartes. I mean, that's something that we have to come to grip with. Human beings are free. I mean, they're not completely free. I mean, we're material beings, so we're in bodies, and so we're subject to the physical laws. We're also subject to social laws because we are social beings, and so we're subject to social, realities. But at the same time, we're free in how we decide, and therefore, as a physician, that's part of what we are compelled to respect. We respect the freedom. So the subjectivity of Churchill, right? Whether he's obese, and I mean, before we can deem him sick, he needs to come to us, to the doctor, and ask for help, right? I mean, he needs to summon the doctor and say, listen, I can't tie my shoelace. What's the problem? And then you can say, well, look, your girth is a little bit out of balance, and if you lost weight, then you'd be more in proportion, and you'd be able to tie your shoelace. So I think that's how we should correctly approach it, as opposed to just imposing on Churchill our notion. Now it's tricky because at the same time you could have incidentally you examine somebody and they look perfectly well, but you hear a rip-roaring murmur of aortic stenosis, and that could be very dangerous. So do you ignore it just because the patient did not complain, or has no complaints about aortic stenosis? No, you don't ignore it, and the patient is really maybe in a state of in a precarious state. And then you have a conversation, and then you can see if they will see it your way, and so forth. So you cannot completely make total general rules of practice about whether you always wait for the patient to have a complaint, right? There are some people, friends of mine, who will say that medicine, we should really take care of people with symptoms. If they don't have any symptoms, just leave them alone. I think that's true for the most part, based on the fact that nowadays in modern medicine, we're so aggressive with our mechanical approach to try to normalize everybody to these norms that we've gone way overboard. On the other hand, there are many things that people may not be aware of. They may not feel sick, yet it's helpful for us to detect. So blood pressure would be a good example, right? People can have high blood pressure, never know about it, yet we get a sense that it's a state of imbalance. And I think if they were wise, they would have they would take their advice about the blood pressure. But at the same time, we still need to respect their freedom, the freedom of patients, and approach them as real human beings, which means free animals, free beings. Okay. Anything else on this humoral theory? I had a graphic somewhere else. I don't have it, where it'd be an analog of the four humors: the yellow bile, the black bile, the phlegm and blood, which are the four humors. Now we have the same kind of four-part humoral theory. Our obsession with cholesterol, glucose, fat, and I don't know what I forgot what the fourth one was, but I had a graphic that sort of imitated by the four, and we essentially practice with according to these new humors, right? The new humors, but to the extent that right, exactly. But to the extent that we focus on them in mechanical ways, I think we completely miss the boat. Okay, Roman. I think we'll leave it at that for this time, and take it up next time.
Great. Look forward to it.
Okay.